afternoon. I'd like to call the joint meeting of the Police Commission and the Santa Barbara City Planning Commission to order and ask Ms. Rodriguez to take the role, at least for the Planning Commission's portion, and I'll turn it over to the chair of the commission to introduce the rest of us.
All right. I'll begin with Planning Commission. Commissioner Schwartz, please.
Here.
Commissioner Larson.
Here.
Commissioner Jordan.
Here.
Commissioner Jacobs. Commissioner Bartlett.
Here.
Vice Chair Lodge.
Here.
Chair Jostis.
Here.
And for Fire and Police Commission, would you like me to continue? Okay. Commissioner Diego Torres Santos.
Here.
Commissioner Signor. Absent. Commissioner Rodriguez. Vice Chair Christensen.
Here.
And Chair Lennon.
Here. Mr. Cato, how would you like to proceed? We've got a special meeting today, and are there any preliminary matters that you would like to talk to us about today, Mr. Cato?
Chair Jordan, since it's a special meeting, we'll dispense with all the normal stuff, and if there's anyone for public comment, and then let's get going.
Great. At this point, I'm going to open up the meeting to public comments from the public. If there's anybody who would like to address either of the commissions on matters which are not on our agenda today, please feel free to come forward. Seeing no one, I will close the public portion. And we are back to our item, which is the application of the City of Santa Barbara at 215 East Figueroa Street regarding the police building report. Mr. Casey.
Good afternoon, Chair Justice and Commissioners, both commissions. My name is Paul Casey. I'm the Assistant City Administrator for the City of Santa Barbara, and happy to be here today to give you a status report on the police building and council action and direction that they've given to us over the last 6 to 9 months. With me today, and also speaking later on, is Deputy Chief Frank Mannix with the Police Department, Josh Hagmark, a Principal Engineer with the Public Works Department, and Captain Gil Torres is also here as a resource from the Police Department. So we'll be hearing more from them as we go through the presentation. So the police building we're here to talk about has been a capital program issue for the city for quite some time. It's an old, outdated building. It's undersized. It has a lot of needs, and we'll talk about that in more detail. And we started getting serious with the City Council in January of this year, bringing to them some new information on the infrastructure needs of the building and also the seismic stability of the building, which led to a series of meetings and a subcommittee task force that was put together with the council and some recommendations going forward. And we wanted to come to both the Planning Commission and the Police and Fire Commission and give you a status report. Both of you were very involved in this capital issue. The Planning Commission, I know, has mentioned this as a very important city capital project for a number of years and has been on your radar. And I think the Police and Fire Commission has been interested because they know what an important element this is in the ability to provide police services to the community. Quick background, building was constructed in 1959. It's a concrete and steel structure. It's an essential facility, means it's up and running 24 hours a day. It's not your office building that goes dark at night and sits quietly, but it's in constant use. 214 officers and staff occupy the building, and it's more than just your typical building. There's a lot of stuff that goes on inside that building. It's the main administrative facility for the police department. It has a holding facility for when they bring suspects into the building. Has a shooting range in the basement. It stores the SWAT equipment. There's criminal record storage that goes on, crime evidence handling. There's a locker and training rooms in the facility, and it includes the 911 communications center. So there's a lot of subcomponents going into this, what on the outside looks like a rather simple building. Some recent history, just to kind of put in context. The space needs of the police building has been known for quite some time. The building's been undersized for the staff of the police department for decades now. So much so that even back in 1999, the city put forward a bond measure to build a new police facility to address those space needs. It did not pass. It got about 45% support, and so that was disappointing, but that was the will of the voters at the time. And we needed to move forward because we still had issues with the building. In 2008, we had a Citizens Infrastructure Financing Task Force that looked at all the infrastructure needs for the city, parks and recreation facilities, other buildings within in the city and the community, some public works issues, and they identified the police building as the top capital priority and need for the city going forward. And like I said, in March of this year, the City Council meeting, they appointed an ad hoc subcommittee made up of council members Rouse, White, and Self to look at this issue, and they brought some recommendations back in June, which I'll finish with later on. Some of the building deficiencies. I think I've already mentioned before, the space deficiencies have been identified for years. Since 1999, since that bond measure didn't pass, the city's approach to this building has been an incremental approach. If we can't build a new facility, then we need to just kind of take stabs at rebuilding important components of the building as we go forward. So the first one that we did about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, was the lobby remodel. And when you took your tour Tuesday morning, you started at the lobby, and it turned out very nice. It was a good quality remodel, gave it a little more space, really improved the record section up front and kind of the interface with the public, and that went very well. The next project then was going to be the locker room remodel, and the locker room is woefully inadequate for the needs of the police department. And initially it was thought that would be about a $2 million project to refurbish the locker room, get some better ventilation into the area and that such. In addition, to address the space needs, we've been leasing what is called the Larson Building, which is right next door off of Anapamu Street. And that's where a number of the administrative and detective sides of the operations have been housed in the Larson Building to get out of the cramped headquarters building and give them some room and space. So that was the approach, and we were moving along pretty well until we really started digging into the locker room remodel. And at this point, I think I'm going to bring up Joshua Hagmark to kind of talk about how things kind of spiraled out of control as you started to unravel what needed to be done in the building.
Thank you. So I was brought onto this project about 2 years ago, and they were working on the locker room project and having a lot of issues with a lot of the building systems. A lot of them were failing, and again, the scope was to just redo the locker room as we were going to incrementally work on the building and kind of, as we had money, trying to repair it. The deficiencies that were uncovered as we worked on it, slowly came apart. I mean, the electrical for the ventilation system in there was very old. Again, the building, 1950s construction, hadn't been touched, hadn't been upgraded. And primarily because this building is in 24-hour, 365 days a year operation. So there really isn't a great time to ever work on this building. And I think another way to kind of bring this into perspective too, a typical office building used about 8 hours a day. And this building is used 24 hours a day for 50 years. That's equivalent to an office building, almost 150 years of an office building kind of being used. So you kind of get a feel for how much use goes on in this building. So the HVAC system has kind of been band-aided and kind of kept together, but it is an old and failing infrastructure as well as the plumbing and electrical. The building is fraught with ADA issues. As you guys saw during the tour, the elevator that was installed in the 80s or somewhere in that time period doesn't actually go to the full floor. And as you can see, it's a one-person elevator. It's almost like a dumbwaiter. It's not really a fully functioning elevator, so people coming to visit the police station cannot actually get full access to the building, along with numerous other issues concerning door handles and just with the hallways. As you kind of saw, it was kind of a maze and things like that that currently wouldn't fit the ADA standards of today. And bring up the challenge of once you get into that building to do just a simple locker room, you really, by law, have to address a lot of these issues. You can't just ignore the fact that these issues exist. Roof needing a replacement. The building has a significant amount of lead and asbestos that has been identified and will have to be properly disposed of. And in order to actually handle most of that stuff, the building has to be, the occupants have to be removed so it can be safely taken out. So another challenge. Fire protection, there is no sprinklers or anything in the building. It wasn't a requirement when it was built, and today it would be. Significantly inadequate parking. Again, they've outgrown it. There is, it's a small site, and so how to better utilize the parking. And then we do have a contamination issue related to a leaking underground fuel tank that we had. It's been removed. It was removed years ago. However, the plume is still there and needs to be addressed. And as you can see, it's not just one issue that's kind of driven this. We've kind of been extensively looking through it, but the combination of all these issues needing to be addressed. What we've tried to put down here is a little decision matrix, and I kind of left off the biggest, and I think the issue that kind of pushed this over the top, and that's the structural performance of this building. As we mentioned, it is an essential services building, and according to the building code, this is a building that needs to be operational immediately following an earthquake. It needs to be a facility that the community can count on. We can run operations out of. We can make sure people are getting help if they need help. So this building is essential. It's a police officer's first line of defense. It's their first weapon. It's their how they can do their job in the field. So it's essential that this building be there and be performing. So starting with that seismic upgrade and the need for the seismic upgrade, and then trickling down into all the things that if we were to just go forward with a seismic upgrade to this building, because it can be done. It's not to say it can't be done. We could make this building bring it up to seismic code. However, it triggers, part of the problem is the ceilings. The ceilings have asbestos in them. They have lead. They're structurally, the weight of those ceilings are something that you would not have in a normal building. They're pretty heavy plaster ceilings that could fall and close off access and injure people. As we mentioned, the asbestos, we need to get people out. These are all just to accommodate the seismic work. The ADA issues, and of course, relocation during construction. Pretty much any project we did in that building would require relocation of some sort to accommodate any work in there because of the contamination. As I mentioned, the HVAC system. If you're going to get in and mess around with the ceilings, the HVAC system, not only from an electrical standpoint, but the ducts are all deteriorating inside, and there's actually the interior lining of the ducts coming out. It's not a hazard, but it is certainly a sign that they need to be replaced. And the fire code, all that area needs to be brought up. There's a lot of combustibles in that building, and so it kind of just lays it out in a way that kind of just explains how it's all kind of connected. There's no easy way to approach this building. We've spent 2 years trying to figure out, is there a smaller project we can do? Is there something we can do? Because money is so constrained. But we ultimately concluded that there wasn't a simple solution to this building, and that we needed to think bigger.
And thank you, Josh. And I'll bring up Deputy Chief Mannix now as well to talk about kind of the operational impacts. But I think as Josh highlights, it's like pulling on a thread. Once you started pulling on it, the thread doesn't stop. Based upon law and building code requirements, it just triggers one thing after another, and you just kind of keep pulling on that thread. And so that makes it difficult. And one of the issues that we're going to have going forward is if we don't replace this building and stay in it, maintaining this building is going to become more and more expensive over time. And we can have questions afterwards, but at some point the HVAC system's going to break. And then how do we replace it without that thread kind of just unraveling everything? And so it just becomes very complicated. Jim Dewey, our facilities manager, is just scratching his head about how he's going to be able to maintain this building over time if we don't do something about it. So I wanted to introduce Deputy Chief Mannix just to talk briefly about kind of the operational impacts. One of the questions we have, great, a new building's all nice, but how does that improve police services to the public and the community as a whole? And so I asked him to speak briefly about that.
One of the things that was brought to your attention early in the presentation was our building is over 50 years old. And if we think back for a second about how much the city of Santa Barbara has changed over the last 50 years, and how much police work in general has changed over the last 50 years. I mean, 50 years ago was prior to Miranda warnings. Many search and seizure issues just weren't issues back in that era of police work. And yet, we're still working out of the exact same building that was designed 50 years ago, trying to do modern police work out of very old equipment. And what this has done over the years is caused a kind of a built-in inefficiency based upon the physical structure of the building. It's difficult, for example, to have real good lines of management and supervision when you're working in different work areas of the building. Generally speaking, people are supervised when they're most closely visited by their supervisor, who is sitting in the general vicinity as the work unit. And in some instances, we don't have that in the building. I can tell you from my own experience as a detective, it was common practice when we worked in the Detective Bureau to keep our voices low, because the suspects could overhear us discussing the case while they were being detained in the interview room. Well, with experience, we learned how to adapt around that and basically whisper to each other, but that's really no way to do business. Another example is we used to have whiteboards that we would make notations about the case, and suspects would actually walk past those whiteboards and read them. So we would intentionally put misinformation on the whiteboards, you know, just to mislead them, because we knew they were going to read it. And I remember at one time my lieutenant came to me and said, this is all so new to me. I haven't seen any of this. And I said, well, boss, it's all phony. And in that sense, you might say it worked to our advantage. But really, when you think about it, that's no way to do business. There's critical adjacencies that are built into modern police facilities that are lacking in ours. For example, you might well imagine that a dispatch center that needs advice from the on-duty watch commander is best served when the watch commander's office is nearly adjacent to the dispatch center. While in our building, they're on separate floors, and in fact, they might even be moved to separate buildings. Now, we can get the job done that way because we've always instituted workarounds to simply make the system work. But nevertheless, those inefficiencies are costing us in our ability to serve the public. For example, over the years, we've had people actually escape from the police building, where they've smashed out windows and they've been able to squeeze through tiny little doors. And we've had to go back and replace those same pieces of glass with attack-resistant glass. And again, we fix the problem, we work around it, but the inefficiency is still there. Ultimately, we realize that, you know, officer comfort for a bigger, better, more spacious building is not the issue here. The issue is, does this building meet our needs to provide quality police services? And certainly our building does not, even though we're striving to meet those services nevertheless.
Thank you, Frank. So the recommendation that came out and that kind of built upon with the City Council subcommittee and ultimately the City Council, what came out of the locker room remodel is that as you kind of pulled that thread and everything kind of unraveled, you suddenly got yourself close to a $25 million project without much to show for it. It still left some structural deficiencies. It still left the space needs. In fact, when you do the structural upgrades, you take away space that you currently have, and so your space needs get more challenging. You still have those ongoing facility maintenance costs that are going to increase over time, and you still have those operational deficiencies. And so we reluctantly kind of came to the conclusion with the City Council that that's not a prudent use of $25 million, that you really need to step back and look about fixing this problem once and for all. So then we looked at a number of rebuilding options, worked on with the subcommittee through a number of meetings with them and talked about a number of options. One was rebuilding on site, and that was the conclusion we came to as the best option. But we looked at a lot of other options. We looked at other city-owned land. I think that's the first prudent thing, is look at land that you already own that keeps the cost down and it's within the city's control. The benefit of building off-site is that you don't have to interrupt the operations of the department in the existing building until you move out to a new site. So that was very intriguing and hopeful for us. We looked at a number of city-owned properties. We looked at the Calle Cesar Chavez property down on the waterfront. Determined that that was not an appropriate location, A, flood zone issues, and then B, also being on the other side of the freeway from downtown. And in case of a seismic event, if the freeway were to collapse and you lost the ability to get into downtown quickly and effectively, that's not prudent planning for putting your emergency facility down there. We looked at the Laguna area where parks and recreation facilities are now, and thought, you know, gee, maybe you move them down to Calle Cesar Chavez and put the new building at the Laguna site. Half that site is in a floodplain as well, so that's a concern. The soils there are very poor. It's on Laguna Street for a reason, and so that would make building a challenge in that regard. And then locationally, you know, one of the themes here that you'll come back to is the police department really likes where they are. The adjacency next to the district attorney and the courts and in being in the center of downtown is really preferable from them. We looked at the commuter lots, both the Coda commuter lot and the commuter lot down at Carrillo near the freeway. Those were options that could be considered. Again, not the preferred location for the police department. It would be very costly and require you to go quite deep or high to replace the existing parking that you had on site if you tried to have a zero-sum loss of parking. And so that made it very challenging as well. And especially the one down on Carrillo Street, very congested intersection with the freeway on-ramp right there. And again, not a preferable place for a police facility if you want to have quick access in and out of the facility at one time. We looked at purchasing additional land or purchasing an existing office building or something like that as kind of an opportunity acquisition. Talked to a couple of commercial brokers, and we've looked at this option over time as well. About 6-7 years ago, we looked at a building that came on the market at the corner of Anapamu and Chapala as kind of an opportunity purchase. Had very good parking, was near the Louise Lowry Davis Center. It was a pretty large building. But as you walked through and realized the amount of retrofitting that you would have to do to an office building to make it become an essential facility for the police department, which has very special needs, you really lose the efficiency of buying an existing building because you almost have to gut a building and start over. The structural upgrades are quite enormous, and their needs are not just your standard open cubicle areas or private office areas. It's very unique, and so you got to take a lot of the interior walls out and just become very difficult. We looked at some public-private partnerships. We got approached by a couple private property owners and said, hey, we'll build you a police building if you then lease it from us. We looked at that. That didn't make much sense. There wasn't a lot of advantage to that. A, the city as a government can borrow money quite cheaply, and so there isn't an advantage of having a privately funded project go forward. The options were kind of a long-term lease, and quite frankly, I think we were more interested in an ownership situation rather than a long-term lease. What's going to happen in 50 or 75 years when that lease kind of comes up? And again, the locations were either in the floodplain or more in the industrial zone, and not as good of a location as we would have preferred. We also talked about police substations. This was discussed quite a bit with the council subcommittee. And if you have questions, we can talk about that as more. There's kind of two different issues with substations. One, if the substation approach is to replace the need for an administrative central facility, such that don't rebuild a 40,000 square foot building, but instead build 4 substations throughout the community. The problem with that is we think that's likely more expensive than building one facility. You're building at 4 different sites, and so you kind of lose the efficiencies of building into one building. And then for a city of our size, the police department felt pretty strongly that that's a very inefficient way to run a police department in a relatively compact city like the city of Santa Barbara, to have 4 different facilities and kind of separating the operational and administrative capabilities of the department into 4 different buildings. So that didn't make much sense. Then there's the other issue, well, what if you just have some smaller substations around in the community? And I think our answer there is that can be an ongoing discussion, but that you still have to have a central administrative headquarters to kind of house all the operational needs. If you then want to have kind of storefront substations in different neighborhoods, you can talk about that. I think there are concerns that that's costly to do, that there's an expectation that they're always staffed, and so that requires additional staffing and operational costs in that regard. But that regardless of that kind of policy question, you do still need a centralized facility. So based upon all that, we preferred the existing police site. Oh, another opportunity we looked at purchasing possibly, because it was maybe coming on the market, the new post office, not the new post office, but the main post office just across the street here from City Hall on Anacapa Street. The U.S. Postal Service contacted us, said they were being prepared to sell it, and so we kind of opened our eyes and said, wow, that is a beautiful historic landmark in the heart of downtown, and quite an asset that we'd like to try to keep somehow in public ownership. And maybe that could be a police building. It's certainly got big enough bones to fit a police building inside of. So we were pretty intrigued by that. The big downside to that was lack of parking. There's only about 40 spaces in the back of the post office, and so that would have been a challenge to try to figure out. And that would have been a problem, but it all kind of became moot. The U.S. Postal Service has decided at this point that they're not selling that building, and so it's not on the market, and so we've kind of stepped away from that as an approach. So the existing police location became the preferred site, best location operationally for the department, and that was a real driving factor. If you're going to build this building, you're going to build it once every 50 to 75 years. Make sure it's in a location that works for you. The proximity to the courts and the district attorney's office is very important to the police department. The cost efficiency of rebuilding on city-owned land as opposed to buying private property and then building on that as well. And for some extent, the neighborhood acceptance and the environmental review is simpler building on the site where the police operations have been there since 1959. Going into a new neighborhood would be a little bit more challenging with issues of trying to work that in. So just a refresher, this is the site between Figueroa and Anapamu. The area outlined in blue is what is city-owned and where the current police building is. The area outlined in red is the leased building, the Larson building that we're leasing now that also provides some additional parking. So council recommended that we pursue the rebuilding option on site and that we retain a project architect team to do a number of items and to do them quickly. One is confirm the space needs and the scope of what the new building needs to be, confirm the site constraints of the site of rebuilding on site, prepare a preliminary design, and most importantly, develop a better cost estimate. The cost estimate we've come to date is a very rough analysis and guess, and so we'd like a much better and more accurate cost estimate of what it would take to rebuild, and develop the design approach and the approval process. So we've moved quite quickly on that. We've already retained an architect team. Council just approved this last Tuesday. The architect, the lead firm is Leach Mounts Architects. They're based in Ventura, but they have outstanding experience in designing and building police buildings, over 100 needs assessments for police facilities and over 73 designs of public safety facilities. So they bring A-plus experience of knowing what a modern police facility needs to be. And then we're very pleased that they teamed up with the local architect firm, Lenvik and Minor, to provide kind of that local context. Designing in El Pueblo Viejo is a challenge, and so we appreciated them teaming up with them. We think they made a very strong team, which is why they were selected. Their initial report is to be presented back to council by February 2012. So that's a quick turnaround. And included in that are a couple check-ins with the Historic Landmarks Commission on the preliminary design, make sure they're heading in the right direction. And then also a formal check-in with the Planning Commission on the environmental review, make sure we're scoping the environmental review appropriately, and also gives you an opportunity to check in on the design and the site planning issues and provide us feedback. So like I mentioned, the initial projected cost is approximately $50 million. But that's a very rough estimate. Please don't hold us to it, and it will most likely change once Leach Mounts Architects are finished with their conceptual design. But that does give us a sense of the magnitude of what this building is going to cost. And we were able to do that based upon other police facilities that have been built in California over the last 10 years and using some of those estimates. We had initially set aside $7 million of redevelopment money towards this effort. It was originally for the locker room remodel, and so that was still available to go towards this project. And then the City Council, as the redevelopment agency, recently set aside an additional $13 million for a total of $20 million towards this project. And the council felt very strongly about wanting to do that, wanting to put a really strong down payment on this project, that if we have to go to the voters and ask for money, that we've got real skin in the game. And so $20 billion towards that is real strong. We do have state issues with the state trying to eliminate redevelopment agencies and then allowing us to recreate redevelopment agencies if we pay them for us, which would be essentially a $14 million check over a period of years to be able to remain in existence. That's being legally challenged. It's before the state Supreme Court. They have taken the lawsuit directly, so it's not going through appeals courts first. And that will be resolved by January of this coming year. So just within the next 4 or 5 months, we'll have an answer about how much money the state might take from the redevelopment agency or not. But regardless, the council's made a commitment to $20 million towards this project. But that still leaves us $30 million short. And the city doesn't have that lying around in the coffers anywhere. And so looking at different funding options is a challenge. And quite frankly, I think it's probably the most serious challenge for this project to be able to go forward. So options include the general fund, which is difficult at this point. Grant money is always something you pursue, but we're not aware of any good grant opportunities that are going to come down the pike, which leads you towards publicly approved financing, which is how most communities go about building new capital projects like new police building. So if we go the public funding option route, there's a number of options that we're going to have to consider. One could be a parcel tax, kind of a flat amount per parcel in the city. Another traditional approach is a general obligation bond, which is based upon the valuation, the assessed valuation of your property, that you pay a certain percentage of that. Many communities lately have been going towards a sales tax approach to kind of raise revenue to then pay off some indebtedness that way. And there are a number of other options and creative ideas that could be considered as well. Another consideration going forward would be whether it's a special tax or a general tax. It's one of the unique things in California that if you have a special tax dedicated specifically for a certain proposal, it takes 2/3 voter requirement to get that approved. Where if you have a general tax that just accrues to the general fund, it only takes a majority approval of the voters. What a number of communities have done is they've gone for a general tax and then had an advisory ballot measure on the same ballot that says, if you approve this general tax, this is essentially what we're planning on spending the money for. And people have been successful that way with getting the lower threshold. So those are all just considerations that are going to have to be talked about going forward. So on the financing approach, the council again recommended using the $20 million of RDA support and then move forward with a schedule that would allow us to consider placing an item before the voters in November 2012 to make up the gap. They haven't firmly committed to being on the ballot in November 2012, but that would be the first opportunity they'd want to consider. And so that's why we're moving quickly on coming up with a conceptual design and a cost estimate to have the information available if we decide to go forward. I think the feeling is November is a presidential election year. That's usually a higher turnout, and those are usually good opportunities to try to get something like this passed. If we want to consider that, we would most likely want to do some polling in early 2012 to try to get a sense of where the community stands, and that's why public education is important, to start having to inform the public about this need and see if there's interest and support to financing it. One issue I want to spend a little time on is the 911 call center. What came out in working with the council subcommittee is we've got this seismically deficient building and we've got the call center in the basement of this seismically deficient building. And that doesn't make much sense. And so if we're going to rebuild this building at some point down the road, we're going to have to move the call center out. Why wait until we're ready to rebuild the building? Let's get the call center out of there now in a temporary manner and into a better location. And so we're working expeditiously on doing that. We have an initial kind of idea of the Granada Garage office building as maybe being a good location for that. And so we're going to work with the architect team that we just selected to do a conceptual design and see if we can't just move the call center over there on an interim location. But that's clearly a much better and safer location for them to be for a period of years while we figure out how we rebuild the existing police station. And we could use redevelopment agency dollars to make that move. And so we think that's a good option. We'll be pursuing that quite quickly. As I mentioned, community support and outreach is going to be very important. So council's directed us to do a number of items to help with that. City TV is going to be working on an informational presentation that they'll be wrapping up in the next couple weeks or a month or so that we can then play on City TV to educate the public about the needs. They asked us to have this joint meeting with you two, to inform you as community leaders so that you're more educated about what the needs are and what the issues are, but also it's on TV. It's another opportunity to use our resource of having City TV to get our message out. We want to try to do public tours of the existing police station. We kind of feel that seeing it is believing it. You know, you can hear the rhetoric and you can read reports, but actually seeing it. And part of what we'd be curious to hear from you today is your tour on Tuesday morning, how that went, and if you thought public tours would be helpful to try to get community leaders and the general public in there. And certainly if we're going to have a ballot measure, we're going to need community support and the community organization of advocates leading this effort and helping to drive a campaign to get the community to support that effort. So to wrap up the council direction, they wanted to confirm that rebuilding the police headquarters is the #1 capital improvement infrastructure priority for the city. They've asked us to hire the design professional team, which we've already done. They've already accumulated close to $20 million of redevelopment agency money. We're working on a fast track so that we can consider placing something on the November 2012 ballot. Consider moving the 911 call center, which we think we have a good option about how to proceed with that, and conduct community outreach and education efforts. So that concludes our presentation. We're all here to answer any questions, and we'd love to hear your feedback and reaction and any thoughts and advice you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Casey. Given the unique nature of today's meeting, having 10 folks up here and and a lot of issues to cover. What I thought I'd do with the concurrence of Chair Lennon is to suggest a structure that we use to get through so that everybody gets a chance to weigh in on both questions and comments. And that structure would be to first start with comment from the public, open and close the public comment portion, then bring it back to the two commissions, and break our questions down into 4 or 5 clusters, and suggest that each person gets a couple of burning questions so that we don't get weighed down in those things, but focus on assumptions and need, locational issues and constraints, design and process issues, and timing, implementation, and cost considerations. And if we haven't covered something that we need to bring up, let's talk about that after we finish those 4 broad categories. Then get into comments and opinions on both the tour, public outreach, and specific observations that commissioners may have that they want to leave with city staff and the police department representatives who really have the responsibility of making sense of what we as commissioners think on this initial perspective. So is that if that's okay with our police commission, let's why don't we go and open up the public portion to see if there's anybody who wishes to comment. And I have a speaker slip from Mr. Kip Bradley. Mr. Bradley, you have 3 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Justice, members of the Planning Commission. My name is Kip Bradley. I'm one of the owners of the neighbor to this building at 201 East Figueroa Street. We're right on the corner of Figueroa and Santa Barbara Streets. We have just undertaken ourselves to do a fairly sizable remodel of the existing building that was there, for the same reasons that our neighbor is hoping to do theirs as well. It was seismically not in good condition. We did have asbestos issues, and we had just other issues that made it impossible for us to renovate the building. And so I understand that it's a very, very large undertaking. It's going to be a costly one. But as a citizen of Santa Barbara and a neighbor, I am here to express our absolute wholehearted support of the project. And it's always, I know as the person who did that work there, we always wanted to have our neighbors on our side. And I'm here to espouse wholeheartedly that we are in favor of this. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, with that, is there anybody else who wishes to address the commission? Yes, please come up and state your name for the record, and we'll collect your green slip.
Hi, I'm Steve Hogerman, and this is catching me all a bit off guard. I, too, am a neighbor, and I am very nervous and scared. I don't have some commercial building. I have a residence. The police department is right on the property line with a residential neighbor. With the neighborhood. I kind of did the impossible 17 or 18 years ago. I actually purchased a Santa Barbara house. It was the smallest, cheapest, junkiest house in Santa Barbara. I restored it with love in that little courtyard right next to the police station of 8 households. It is now, if you walk up there, and I don't think the tour went through that, and I don't know if you're going to open up to the public to see that little gem of a secret spot in Santa Barbara. Now all the houses are restored, and it's a beautiful, wonderful little spot of people who can actually afford to live in Santa Barbara in their own home. It makes me very nervous, and I don't know what you have in mind here. I can imagine a 3-story wall up on the property line with my little house on the other side. You know, I kind of like having the sun come in my window in the afternoon in the winter. I open the curtains and let the sun come in to heat my home. The cat sits in a little pool of light. This is a house where I'm going to retire and live out the rest of my life. And you just heard a neighbor, but of a more commercial building. I didn't hear one mention of the neighborhood and the people who live in this neighborhood. I probably have a lot more to say, but this is just a jumble of things in my mind, and I feel kind of overwhelmed here. I see a lot of people with coats and ties, a lot of friends of the police and fire department, as well it should be, but I feel a bit overwhelmed, and I'm very nervous about where this project may be leading the rest of my life and the quality of my life in Santa Barbara. Thank you.
We hope that you continue to be engaged in this process, because I know the city doesn't just willy-nilly go about plopping something down, and hopefully this and any follow-up meetings will give you more information that you can then make some judgments and weigh in again on concerns that you have.
I wish I had the time and energy and money to do a PowerPoint presentation for 40 minutes for you.
Thank you. Okay, seeing no one else coming forward, is there anybody else? Okay, at this point I'm going to close the public portion and bring it back to the commissions. And why don't we start with Ms. Schwartz, and we'll just walk on down the dais here. Any pressing questions regarding the assumptions under which this project is being conceived, or the need? Ms. Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the category that you've given of function and need, I have a question about the information technology. I think that Lieutenant Whittam, I think that's who gave us the tour, showed us the room that I believe is jointly managed San Luis Obispo County, Santa Barbara, Ventura through a joint powers agreement. And I have particular concerns about the vulnerability of that technology and our use. So as the 911 center may be moved out or will be moved out to Granada, is there any plan to move the IT function and equipment out at an interim staging as well?
No, there would be no need to do that in order to facilitate the 911 move.
Okay.
I should point out that we do have an off-site facility that has backup, so that should we have a catastrophe at the police department, our data is preserved. But we are the CLETS switching station for the JPA, and we would think we would be so in the future with the new building.
Okay, and would you envision that we'd continue that joint powers agreement among the three counties with the two other
Yes.
counties in our build out that wooden shift? Okay. In terms of need, I wanted to find out what the total acreage is that we need, if it reflects exactly the footprint of the total acreage we have now. I think you mentioned 40,000 square feet for the actual new building. What do we have in acreage in our current property there?
Commissioner, currently we have about a little over an acre there.
Okay.
So it's a pretty tight little site that we have. I think the desire would be obviously to have more space, but we're hopeful. We've done some cursory looks at it, and that we can work with the site. We're just going to have to be really creative with underground parking and things like that to make this work.
Okay. Lastly, Mr. Chair, my question is about cost. So with the redevelopment agency monies somewhat in a vulnerable state right now with what's happening up at the state Supreme Court, should the municipalities prevail, the $20 million is secure, Mr. Casey, would you say?
Yeah, Mr. Chair. And
Been earmarked, so to speak?
Correct. The redevelopment agency and city council just did kind of a multi-year capital program for the remaining life of the redevelopment agency. Even if we prevail legally, the agency expires in 2015. So we're at the very tail end of the life of the redevelopment agency regardless. But as part of that multi-year capital program, they set aside $20 million for this project. So yes, council's already made that commitment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Schwartz. Ms. Larson.
Mr. Chair, I don't have any questions at this
You
time.
have a building that is named after you that
I'm
borders
so
this.
excited. I never knew it.
You
know, being married to my husband, there's a treat every day. Anyway, I have no questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez.
Consider using the back parking lot and going underground for parking and coming up a level going parking and going 2 floors up and then extending it to the new building? After remodeling?
Actually, Commissioner, that's exactly what we're kind of talking about because of the grade differential between Anapamu and Figueroa is some type of underground parking in there and then surface parking from Anapamu, if that makes any sense. So it is going to be kind of taking advantage of the grade difference between the two streets to try and work this building into the neighborhood without it being an enormous
And so,
monstrosity.
so from there in the back parking, you would go up, possibility?
I'll actually
Make
go
more
down.
office space?
Yeah, like if you pulled in off of Anapamu, the backside of the parking, it would be a flush lot. If you came in for Figueroa, you would go underground.
Right.
Yeah.
Now I'm talking about just the parking lot. As you come in Anapamu, why can't you go still build up on top of that a couple floors?
We certainly can, and we're going to be looking at different options, but our cursory review before we brought in this architect was to see, could we make something work? Was this even feasible? And so we did not look at going up further with a parking structure. It may, our assessment may come back, our needs assessment that the architect's working, may say that we do need to go up one floor with a parking structure. What really eats up with a parking structure is the actual floor ramps. It eats up a lot of space, and we're trying to.
Right, I'm not talking about parking. Once you get to two, you got one underground and one on top. I'm talking about going up a level for office space, for more room for the department.
Correct. That would be the idea. This building would be on top of the parking. So yes, and we try to keep it relatively in the same position the current facility is at. So so the building would be on top of the parking.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. Mr. Bartlett, questions on assumptions and need?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If the needs analysis was actually prepared in 1999 for the previous failed bond measure, it would have been nice to have maybe had that included, because we've been asking a lot of questions, what were the needs? So I don't know what they were at that baseline, and what has changed in the last 12 years. Have the needs drastically grown, or through technology have they shrunk? Can you clarify that a bit?
Yes, sir. In 1999, I was actually on the committee to pass Measure R99, which was the new building measure. At that time, the police building was designed to also incorporate some fire capability, because the fire station 1 had yet to be seismically retrofitted, although that need had been recognized. So there was a needs plan that was put together that included both police and fire. Since that time, the fire station 1 has been seismically fit, so that need is no longer apparent with the city. And also, since R99, we have learned that the current police building is not seismically intact. It was always our assumption, and there was no effort in 99 to make a seismic assessment of the building. But since that time, we have looked at it. Engineers have called some things to our attention, and we decided we better get a true seismic opinion as to the suitability of this building. And we have only recently discovered that the building is seismically unfit. So those are the two major changes since that needs assessment was done in 99.
So to just quantify the general size of the box, are we looking at a 40,000 square foot plus or minus building? Or?
Plus or minus, that's correct. And
then I know parking drives everything, and I know it's very underparked. Do you know about what you're looking at for number of vehicles needing to be on site at any given time?
We do have the number of vehicles, and all of that information is being shared with our consultant, who is doing the needs assessment now. Okay. So really, we're waiting for him to make a true professional opinion as to what a modern police department should look like to serve the community this size, and then he's going to show us what that looks like.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. Chair Lennon.
I have no questions.
Okay. Vice Chair Christensen.
Mostly my questions pertain to cost considerations and financing, so I'll hold those till later.
Thank you. Mr. Torres Santos. Oops, let's skip it. Ms. Lodge. I'm sorry. Questions on assumptions and need?
Yes. There seem to be, well, having had the tour, I don't see that, I don't have any question about the need. But is the possibility, since some of the police, I assume the idea would be that the police uses that are currently, and I believe it's called the Larson Building, would come into the new building. Would it, is it just utterly out of the picture financially to consider buying that property and making it part of the project? It sounds as if it would make it a better project.
Commissioner Lodge, it's one of the questions we've had. We have not had favorable responses from the property owner of the Larson building to selling us the building. We've asked that question, and they said they're not interested at this time. We think that that might be something that kind of evolves as the architect's kind of looking at the site planning, because you're right. I mean, it makes it a more constructible lot. There's more room to work with if you do have control of that property. But at this point, we don't have a willing property owner who's interested in selling.
Thank you. Mr. Torres Santos?
One question. So in regards of this whole presentation, this is just the whole layout first of what will lead into then the whole platform of understanding what's going to be next. Is that correct?
Correct. We're still very early. We've just hired the professional firm who then is going to dig in, do the needs analysis, and do some conceptual design. And so you're here for informational purposes, and then you'll have more to react to once that work is conducted over the next 5-6 months.
All right, thank you.
Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one quick question. Having to do with other sites or buildings, Mr. Casey. I've seen other police stations, not for any bad reason, but I've seen them where the entire facility was secure out to the perimeter of the entrance. Or I've seen them where the public part of the facility was public and the rest of the facility was secure, whether maybe you went down a chute and you're in a corral and that's as far as you could go. So when you were looking at other buildings and facilities, I guess the begs the question to me on the separation between what I would call the public section, whether it's the call center, the countertop, that type of stuff, and the actual operational centers where there's officers and work going on, and whether that could be feasibly split up either at another location that you looked at because you thought that the costs involved with making the whole thing secure were too astronomical, or could that be two locations where you had the public access at one location and somewhere adjacent you had the secure access?
I'll take the first stab and then let Deputy Chief Mannix chime in if he wants to. You know, I think the police department preferably would like to be all on one site. It's just there's so many interrelationships among their operations that they don't want to be into separate buildings. I will say that just very conceptually, we've kind of been scratching our heads ourselves that this is a tight site. Building an essential facility to the highest seismic standards required under state law makes it a very expensive building. So we've talked about, are there some components of the building that maybe don't have to be in there that we could build more cost effectively offsite on other city-owned land, like some of the storage, large storage areas of evidence or something? Does it have to be in the building, or could we do that? The shooting range is something else. Could that possibly be built off-site? And I think the police folks will say, prefer it all to be together, but yeah, there might be some opportunities. And so I think that's part of the creative options we're going to be talking with the police department and the architect firm about, to see if there's a way to keep the cost down as much as possible, because we know that's going to be a real important point.
And just to chime in, Mr. Jordan, is one of your points about building security, it really shouldn't be overlooked that our building is not secure. Any member of the public can walk into the parking areas. Unfortunately, we've had our police vehicles have been vandalized over the years. We've had employees' vehicles who have had their tires slashed by disgruntled citizens. It's just not a secure building because when it was constructed 50 years ago, security of that type wasn't in mind. And it's very difficult to add modern security features because of all the setback requirements and everything that's just modern. And it's very difficult to do that. So as a result, our building is not as secure as we would like it to be. I can think one very prominent example where a homicide suspect committed a homicide in the field. And then when all the police were leaving the station to go to the scene of the shooting, the suspect drove to the police department and walked into the lobby holding a gun in his hand and wanted to surrender. Most homicides are not solved so easily, but I can tell you the records clerks were very concerned with a homicide suspect with a gun. And our janitor actually went out and took the gun from the suspect. It was an amazing bit of work. No one was injured post the shooting. But our lobby was not set up to be secure for our own staff. Now, we fixed that problem since this time with the lobby remodel. But this is just another example of where our building is not meeting our needs.
Thank you. My question has to do with this need. You're going to be doing a new needs assessment. and then you're going to be coming back with an articulation of what are the driving forces here. Are you going to focus on the problem at hand or the needs, and is that going to be framed from the police department standpoint or from the community standpoint? Because I think there's the how you frame this may be the most important question that you need to answer.
Very good point, and appreciate your feedback and comments in that regard. My hope and expectation is that it's both. That it's a needs analysis of the operational needs of the department, but that it also is addressing the service component to the community as well.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, let's move on to locational issues and constraints, and we'll start with Mr. Jordan. No comments? Any questions of staff? No questions of staff on locational issues and constraints. Mr. Torrey Santos?
No questions.
Okay, Ms. Lodge?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Casey, I know that Don Olson was working very hard on trying to acquire the two armories. And I take it that those are, and one of the thoughts was that one of them would make a good site for a new police station. I take it that his efforts didn't bear fruit.
No, and I've kind of assumed that responsibility and efforts since he's left haven't borne fruit either. Real quick, what Commissioner Lodge is talking about, there are two facilities. One is the National Guard Armory, which is between the high school and the junior high on Canon Perdido Street. And I think everyone recognizes that we would like to get the community's hands on that well underutilized and not well maintained property and put it into community use. There's an effort right now to try to do that more geared towards educational use because it's proximity to the high school and the junior high. It's going to be very costly to do so. They require you to purchase them property off-site and build them a replacement facility, and in exchange for that cost, you then get the ability to gain control of the existing site, which is then going to require a great deal of money to retrofit and come up. So I think there's a big financial hurdle there, but there is some effort going for educational uses on that one. And the other one is the Army Reserve site out at Las Positas and State Street. It's a pretty small site. I don't think it would be big enough for a police building and locationally not preferred, but we were working with the Police Activities League about doing some sort of youth center there and having conversations. But again, we hit the same hurdle. They require you to build them a replacement facility off-site, and the dollars just weren't close enough to make a run. So we continue to keep those in our radar and look for an opportunity, but as of this point, they don't look real viable.
Thank you. Same story as with the Naval Reserve Armory at the harbor.
Okay, Ms. Christensen.
No questions.
Okay, Chair Lennon?
No question.
Does anybody else have it? Mr. Bartlett? I knew we'd get some at the right side of the table here.
Well, I had a thought since we had our site visit the other day, and it seems like there's a simultaneous effort now with, I believe it's the state court system looking at the Hayward's property, and I'm trying to understand the logistics. If you're going to rebuild on site, obviously you need to relocate somewhere else in the interim, and there's a lot of expense related to that, and we need to make sure that that's kind of factored in to this analysis. But both of those entities, the police department and the state courts, they all want to be near the courthouse. Is there any consideration of building a new police station on the Hayward site, moving the police once, and then the courts taking over the current police station site so that it's a win-win and more efficient for both parties, and they're still both close to the courthouse?
Yeah. Thank you, Commissioner Bartlett. You're always the creative one with good ideas.
I'm always in trouble, too.
We've had conversations with the Superior Court and have kind of been following their project, and they're a little further ahead from us in that standpoint, in that they have done property acquisition. They really want to stay close to where their existing facilities are. Their current plan is to build off of their Figueroa Superior Court and keep it, and then build off behind it, which is how the Hayward's property then comes into connection. And we don't quite have it here on the map, but they tie into the middle of the parcel. I don't think that they would feel that our police station is of sufficient size. Their building is quite a bit larger than ours. They have needs for a sally port for buses to come in to do prisoner exchanges and that sort of stuff. And so that hasn't seemed like a real opportunity. We even kind of bounced around the ideas it's some sort of joint facility that you kind of combine up with, and they really want to keep it separate, and I think that makes sense.
With that same train of thought, what about the site that was identified for the transit center? I don't know if that's going forward or not. That's on Figueroa Street, just on the other side of State Street, where you could build a new facility and then move once.
Correct, and that similar to the commuter lots, the challenge there is if you're going to replace the parking there, which has been kind of a policy the council has had, that if we're going to take a city parking lot, we're going to replace the parking so we're not losing downtown parking assets. Once you try to replace that parking, add the parking for a police station, and then put the building on top, you get into a more complex and difficult construction site to do. But your point is well noted, and we really have thought a lot about that. It certainly would be simpler logistically to build off-site and then just move once. And so we have factored in relocation costs, because that will be costly, and it's almost a project in and of itself. Talking to the police folks, moving the 911 call center is probably the most important, complicated part of a relocation effort. And so by doing that ahead of time, then makes it more of a find an office space to rent for a while that you just kind of retrofit. You can use trailers on existing city sites. You have some flexibility. It's costly, and we've factored that into the budget, and we'll continue to do so, but it's doable.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Rodriguez, any questions on location issues?
How about having a substation, Deputy Chief Mannix, and the north side? That was brought up a long time ago by having a substation north side and having a captain run it or something like that.
Over the years, we've looked at the possibilities of substations, north side, east side, different locations throughout the city, because they tend to be popular with community members, because everyone wants a police department kind of near where they live. And from the paradigm of increasing police efficiency, it seems popular. However, when we look at the pragmatics of how much it's going to cost to staff a substation, how much it's going to cost to build one, it's actually very expensive and very expensive to run, because it's one thing to build a building, but then you have to have an infrastructure in place to operate out of that building. And personnel costs are about 80% of our police department budget. So when we look at substations, we're looking at a substantial increase in the size of our department in order to man that station. And it really isn't efficient in terms of the needs of the city from a police perspective, in terms of getting our resources out into the community in a rapid response model. We can do that just fine from our current paradigm.
Ms. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could somebody grab a mouse and show us where where Mr. Hogerman's property is? Just, I didn't get it indicated. That's my only question. I just want to be aware of.
I have to assume I didn't catch his address, but there are these bungalows here just to the north of the existing police building, I'll figure.
Okay, because I know we also have Villa Santa Barbara, and you can see that quite largely at the top, which is kind of kitty-cornered from it. Okay, thank you.
Ms. Schwartz, any questions?
Yes, on financing. So if the bond or tax measure does not go through in November, that's $30 million of our $50 million. Do we have a plan B?
At this point, no. And that's the problem. I think if we had a plan B, we wouldn't be thinking so much that we're going to have to go to the voters to ask for financing, because we know that's going to be a big hurdle to try to cross.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Casey, this project is pretty close to the courthouse. Courthouse is a landmark. We've been spending some time on historical issues as it pertains to the general plan update, and we've been looking at a 250-foot buffer. How do we deal with this in the context of a public safety project of critical need?
It's a very good question, and I think that's why we're happy that Len Vicken Minor is on part of the team, someone who's very sophisticated and knowledgeable about building in El Pueblo Viejo and with landmark buildings nearby. B, checking in early with the Historic Landmarks Commission and making sure we're designing something that's sensitive to those issues and meeting their needs. And then C, I'd say we have the benefit of a really deep site that designing something that faces Figueroa Street will be a challenge, but that as you get further into the site, if you look here on the map, you have the jury building, which is a tall 3-story building that separates the courthouse from where we're building, and then next door is the district attorney's office, which is a 4-story building. And so you're actually shielded quite well from the historic county courthouse. And so I think there are some unique opportunities here to design something that can meet those needs as well.
Is there an interest on the part of staff of bringing these difficult questions to the forefront as this new committee is focusing on a historic resources element? And are you prepared to ask these very types of questions as Plan Santa Barbara goes through its final stages of review, so that the council and everybody else knows where the values of this city and its staff and its leaders line up when it comes to balancing public safety issues and historical resources issues?
Great suggestion. We'll do that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next set, design issues and process issues. Any questions on this from anybody? Okay. Yes, Mr. Bartlett.
Was there any consideration to really getting early community involvement? And I think I know the answer to this already since the contract was let on Tuesday, but of really doing a public design charrette to engage the public and get early buy-in and support and have the public help run this rather than just hire an out-of-town consultant to come in and do a report and make it feel like it's not from Santa Barbara. I realize there's a local component, but I think we know how well the charrette is working with Plan Santa Barbara. Maybe we could make it work for this, but anyway.
We're on a fast track. We have a really tight schedule to turn something around, but we want to include that public involvement in this process as well. But one of the first things you have to do is you have to know, what are you trying to build? What are you even starting with? And that's why we needed to get this firm on board to work with the police to understand their operations and their space needs, so at least you know what box you're trying to work with. And then we are asking the architect team to work with the immediate neighbors and the community at large to help design something that can work. From a design standpoint, with the existing site, you're somewhat boxed in. It's a tight site. It's going to be what it's going to be. And so it's not like we're dealing with a 5-acre site that gives us a lot of flexibility about how to move things around. And I think Chair Jostes kind of joked on the site tour, what site isn't tight in Santa Barbara? And this is another tight one that we're going to have to fit in.
Okay. Other commissioners with questions regarding design issues and process? Okay, I have a couple. First, on the design issue, what are your space needs such that you're going to want to go 4 stories? Where are you looking to go in terms of height of the buildings to get your needs met? Are we talking 4 stories and 60 feet here? I think it'd be really good to have that discussion, just like the previous question I raised.
I agree.
In exactly the same context.
That's right. Our hope is it doesn't have to go to 4 stories and 60 feet, because I think many in the community will feel that that's too large of a building, but we don't know yet. That go back to the issue of we need this firm to get on board and to understand what the space needs of what the new building needs to be. But they are, I think, going to look at parking creatively. They're going to look at going down, use the ability of the grade differential to go subterranean quite possibly, which then keeps the overall height of the building down. But I don't have an answer for you yet because we don't know exactly what it is we're going to be trying to put back in.
Okay. Second question is, this is a non-residential project, so it comes under Measure E, at least while we have Measure E. And the question is, if Measure E puts out hard limits in terms of traffic and resources, is this project dead in the water if it creates unavoidable traffic impacts?
We don't think so. We don't know that answer yet. Again, because the operations of the police department aren't going to change much from what's on the site now, at this point, I'm not envisioning any traffic impacts. From the Measure E standpoint, yes, if the building is larger, we're going to have to take from that pool of square footage that was identified, and we think there's adequate square footage to do that.
Okay. Other questions? Let's go on to timing, implementation, and cost considerations. Anybody like to start out? Ms. Christensen.
A couple of questions about the cost and the proposed financing. You talked about $20 million that you're prepared to commit from the RDA. And I am aware of some of the significant obstacles that we are facing with the state right now and the litigation there. Does that represent all of the available RDA resources left over?
No, it does not. The council took kind of a, not quite a balanced approach. This was by far the largest project that they set money aside for of $20 million. But when they looked at kind of the last 5 years, 4 years of the redevelopment agency, they did identify a number of other community priority needs that they have funding set aside as well. We did have the discussion with them, though, that if they didn't build any other project for the remainder of the redevelopment agency and put every dime into the police building, I think that got us around $34 million. And so it still left us a good $15, $16 million short that we'd have to finance. And so that was the analysis they did.
And does that 20 or 30 million assume the alimony state payment to the state if you were required to make that and be a going concern?
That's a gentle. I haven't heard of alimony. We've always called it a ransom payment, but it's interesting. The city council is going to have to reprioritize their capital program if the litigation fails and we have to pay upwards of $14 million over the next 3 years to the state. And so they're going to have to rebalance that capital program. My expectation or my thought, I don't have a vote. It's up to the city council, but I think they're very committed to this project, and I don't know what they would do, but I think they would try very hard to keep the $20 million set aside for this project and pare it back from other projects.
And the remaining 30 million then, or we'll just talk about whatever you need remaining. Let's assume all the RDA resources are in that are available. Where do COPs fall into your description of general fund or other options? Have those been considered? Certificates of participation?
Yes, we did look at that, and that's essentially the general fund concept, is that you could issue certificates of participation, but then you need a revenue stream. You need some sort of financial mechanism to pay off that debt. And that's the difficult part, is if that's, $3 million a year, that's $3 million the council would have to try to find out of the general fund, which is very challenging considering the amount of cutbacks we've had to do over the last few years already.
Yeah, I can appreciate that, although you did talk about some of the increasing maintenance costs that you foresee just by having the existing building. So it seems like there'd be a certain diversion of that money into those COP payments. It also doesn't require election. It also doesn't impose a new tax on folks. So I see that as maybe a more palatable option for a portion or all of the remaining financing need that you might have. So something to consider.
Yep.
That's all. Thank you.
Good questions. Anybody else on timing, cost, and implementation? Mr. Bartlett? I see your motion towards the mic. Okay. Are there any other burning questions that we haven't covered by anybody? Okay. Go ahead, Mr. Bartlett.
So if we get the new building that we're all hoping to create that has better adjacencies and is more efficient, will that equate into a smaller workforce?
Not likely. I think we would be a more efficient workforce, but I think our workload is supported by the crime trends in the community more than the physical layout of our building.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. Regarding the choice of approach to a ballot initiative, general fund versus sales tax versus property tax, can you give us a sense of the type of criteria you would be suggesting to the council to help them make that choice? I mean, obviously, a priority, I mean, getting something passed and equity, but give us a sense of how you're thinking about this.
And those are some certain issues, and it's a very political question, so the council, I think, is going to lead that more than staff. But certainly, I think as we're assisting them in that conversation, I think you look at equity, as you say, you look at what seems to be a fair approach. You do polling. You do polling to see where the community comes, and you test different measures and different approaches to raising the revenue and see where the community stands up front. I think you look at other jurisdictions and the success and failure levels of different approaches throughout the state of California. There's some really good resources that kind of document that every election cycle. So I think that kind of helps inform you and give you some idea. And I think those are generally some of the criteria that you look at going forward.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Casey. Okay, comments? Who would like to start? I'm going to start with Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Just move down the dais here.
And I will jump all over my notes. I had some really good notes till we got to this meeting, so now I've kind of jimmied them up. I'd certainly like to say that I am as much in support of this project as anybody could be. That said, I'm your poster child for problems on getting it passed with a voter bond or some other method. I don't have a good track record. I was in support of the county jail measure. I have not supported, despite having children throughout every part of the system, I have not supported the last 3 educational ones in town. I seem to have a really small window on what's acceptable and benefit for me and return on investment and promises made and what's actually put together at the end of that. And I think that's your biggest problem. I don't think it's going to be about making the good argument. I think it's going to be about counteracting the bad argument. And we talked a little bit about that the other day. I think you know what I mean. What I took from the tour the other day was less, although it's hideous, the current status of that building. But I took less from that than I did the actual operational lack of integrity of that building. And Deputy Chief Mannix touched on it a little bit, and I certainly don't want to tell any secrets, but you're one moment away from an accident or a tragedy happening in that building due to lack of security, the logistical mix of workers and police officers where criminals would be being processed or worked with. And I can just hear people saying, if that was to happen, that why didn't we do something? Why weren't we out in front of that? And this is certainly a step in that direction. It's not the step in that direction. It's the required step in that direction. I can certainly just from that hour, I can point to multiple examples of just being a moment away from a tragedy or an accident, and it's unfortunate. I'll just go down my list. I know what you're interested really is suggestions and how to move forward, and I think and most of mine reflect the outreach and community engagement process, because I think you can put the matrix back up there, the decision matrix, but again, that's only a thing. You really have to get it by an electorate before the things can get resolved. And I think you clearly are going to have to show that you've looked at and exhausted any other options and any imaginative options, and that the option that you're proposing is clearly the only on-the-ground reality that will work, and that there aren't other options to consider. And that any of the other options, or leaving it like it is now, is worse than what you're proposing. I want to make the better choice than the one you're leaving me with. And in this particular case, the better choice would be, I think, a ballot measure. The gentleman that was in here from the adjacent property, I had already written this note down, but I really perked up because he said he was a little intimidated in here. There's a bunch of guys in suits. And that's my recollection, too, of being on the wrong side of the jail bond vote, was that that was carried out in the community by a bunch of middle-aged white guys in suits with little things on their lapels. It was not a peer-to-peer horizontal engagement with the community. And it's one thing to say that you need community leaders to step up and run this campaign, but I think the emphasis has to be much more down in the weeds, like Mr. Justice would say. It has to be neighborhood groups. It has to be nonprofits. It has to be business owners who will then take up your campaign and talk to their peers in order to reach the general electorate rather than a set of community leaders. And another one of them walked out of the room, Mr. Bradley. I mean, Kip Bradley. That's exactly the type of person you should be looking for and cultivating. I know I'm going to look at this process as it goes forward and be really disturbed with the HLC and EPV process. Because I can't think of anything else that more clearly sets itself aside and asks for relief from design and design requirements than a functioning police department facility. And I don't know how we reconcile that. I just know in my mind there should clearly be some relief given at the start that's clear and made part of the process of the community outreach. So somewhere between now and November 2012, I don't witness arguing over a really expensive doorknob versus a normal doorknob because of design considerations to fit in with EPV. That would essentially move me backwards in my decision to vote appropriately on this project. And that's just a little example from probably my household. There's a couple words I heard today that I think we need to work on. One of those was preferred. I heard it several times. And while I think it's nice, I think it's essential and believe that the police department believes it's preferred, that their functions are all in one place. I think we can find a better explanation for that than preferred. I think we need to make sure that we continue to link up presentations like that and that they're operational necessities, not preferred, and make our case that they are operational necessities. I also heard that we're on a fast track. I don't think that's a good phrase either because people start to back up in this community when you hear we're on a fast track. I think if we want to be on a fast track, then we also need to be on a fast track with the community members and engaged with neighborhood groups to get them on board the fast track before we get out on our fast track. And then I think I would echo one of the police commissioners whose name I've already forgotten, I'm sorry, that the issue of RDA priorities should be addressed up front too and out in public. And I don't know what that list is right now, but the list that's going forward, let's just say, for example, because there's one I can remember, if I have to choose between, and I think this is not correct because I think the timeline's wrong, but if I had to choose between a new courtyard for the library and an effective functioning police department operational building, clearly in my mind the choice is for a police department. And so I would again not want to be in the position coming up to a November 2012 vote and have people slinging that mud at me saying, why are you building this or why are you building that with RDA funds, when we would clearly prioritize that at being the top of our list and such a priority that we would exhaust the RDA for the police department before we would build whatever is on that list. And if we can justify our way out of keeping those other things on that list, then again I think that's a conversation that happens up front and engaged with community members and residents so that they realize what those priorities are and have a chance to respond to them. I think there'll be plenty more. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. Mr. Torres Santos?
Most of which, as hearing from today, I'm glad to hear that it's actually going to be going forward, that there's going to be hopefully a new whole plan for the police department. It's an historical building and it's needed to be fixed. And the thing is, which we're all probably going to be touching on, is that the community input is going to be very important to this issue, about the neighborhood, about everybody knowing and putting their input into caring about which buildings they want in Santa Barbara. And with touching on this, understanding it's going to be maybe possibly a hard task to do, but that it could happen. And with this step forward, the next forward, all the community needs to put their input into what they have to do. So that's what I'll leave with that.
Ms. Lodge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with some of the things that my colleague has said, but I don't. I think part of what makes Santa Barbara is EPV, and working with the Historic Landmarks Commission. I'm glad you're going there. I don't think there's any reason why. I've often said that bad architecture doesn't cost any less than good architecture, or good architecture doesn't cost more than bad architecture. And this should be a good building, a building that the city will, and its people will be proud of. And I think you're going to have that to get people to vote for it as well. It is going to be a hard sell. And the thing that walking through that really got me is looking at those ceilings that could conceivably, in an earthquake, fall down and block the ability for anybody to get around in there. And when we'd be out, and it might not be anything that would make the building collapse, but it might make it unusable. And we've got, it's going to have to be figure out a way to get that message out there, so that people will vote for it. I think you are going to have to go for a bond issue. Of course, you want to make it as small as possible. I think the general tax idea, can go for 50% rather than 2/3, which is very difficult. It seems a better way to go, or a more likelihood of getting approved. I do appreciate I think it's Hogerman, the property owner next door with residential uses. I do hope that as the design goes forward, those concerns will be kept in mind. It's been 30 years since I made my first visit for this purpose to the police department, and the issues haven't changed. They've just gotten worse now that we know that there are real seismic issues. So I'm fully supportive as well.
Thank you, Ms. Lodge. Ms. Christensen.
First, my comments about the tour, and one thing I think that was left out was actually the connection to the Larson building, just because it would seem to me to provide a more complete picture as to what your actual space needs are. The fact that you're using that space, how big is that space, how is it laid out internally, what does the staffing look like, at a given time. So there was, especially as we come in today and I look at it on a map so I can see it in proportion, there's that missing piece, and I might add that. The flip side of offering these public tours is something that always strikes me as well, and it's a security issue. It seems to be counterintuitive to walk anybody who wants through your secured facility to show them how everything's laid out and where everything exists. So, I guess you'll just have to struggle with that and do the best you can, because it really was very powerful. To me, one of the most powerful things that I took away was, the general condition, obviously that funny little elevator, which is wholly inadequate from an ADA standpoint. And then those locker rooms, which are abominable. I walked away. That's why I didn't really have a lot of questions about the assumptions on need. They were very present and very visual to me. That being said, my husband is a retired sheriff, and I do have a soft spot for law enforcement, and I feel the need to provide them with, basic safe working conditions and the tools that they need to do their jobs. Public safety, to me, is our number one thing we deliver to our citizens. And it seems like in order to do that, we also owe our police officers, our sworn men and women, and the folks that support them in civilian positions, the things they need to do their jobs, especially in an actual true emergency, be it an earthquake or something else. So, tying those things together, I'll leave that to you, but those were some of my observations, and some of the additions that I would make is at least adding that Larson space so you can feel what the complex looks like, and then how you're going to relate that, I mean, really bringing those folks back over into a single structure. And then as far as the financing goes, I noted back in the report to the council, this is identified as the #1 capital infrastructure need and project. And to me, from that standpoint, I can't think of any other use for a single RDA dollar that would be more important than that police headquarter building. I would even go so far as to beyond what you have as total available RDA funding of up to $34 million. I would say, I'd ask you, what are the legal restrictions on liquidating certain holdings in that RDA portfolio? I mean, I'm thinking of the recent purchase of the million or something so hotel on State Street over in San Roque. Seems like if it were legally permissible, you could liquidate that property, especially since it's not in play yet, and to convert those monies over to this project to make sure that you have the necessary financing. I would feel like, as a citizen, that my representatives had failed me if they didn't put everything they could into this project to make sure it happened, especially now when you know you have seismic issues that you've identified. Moreover, I really think you are going to have significant obstacles. I don't have any hope that you will get voters to approve either a general or a special tax. We did go through it with the jail. I, too, am one who has not voted for the recent school measures. They pass, interestingly enough, anyway. And yet I was willing to put my vote behind that jail and to support the sheriff and support the sheriff's department and get that going. And I'm not a big supporter of jails, but I was willing to go ahead and put my vote where my mouth was. And yet it failed monumentally, I think to the tune of a 61% no vote. So the certificates of participation are something we do at the county, as needed. It provides ridiculously low-cost financing, especially in this environment. It does mean that you don't have to save up for a very long time to pay for your project at one time. It provides you that 20-year window to pay back with your general fund resources, and we have identified at least some savings. So if you can size this right, I think that that's really your best hope. And those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair Lennon.
I really have nothing to say. She said it all for me.
All right. Mr. Bartlett?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I do think, the biggest obstacle is getting the public to endorse the financing that we need to really make this real. So I'm, really hesitant on spending too much money until we can get to that point. And I think it's important to really engage the public early and try and get them on board. I think the consultants you've already hired really need to be working in the public realm so that it's not a secret. And I think when it does go onto the ballot, I think the voters need to feel like there's a choice. It's not spend more money or don't spend any. I mean, I think it's you either fund the money for a new facility or you fund almost as much money to remodel an old facility and get less for it. I mean, it's not like the choice is we're not going to have to spend any money. So I think it needs to be approached in the appropriate way. I think the best thing that you have going for you is that the people that least like to spend the money are the ones that want more police. So I think you really need to play that card. They can't have both. If they want more police, they need to spend more money to get it. And I would sure hope, though, that with a new facility that the efficiencies would somehow translate into the dollars as well, even if it doesn't on the construction, at least on future operations. So I think you really need to play off of that as being a really strong sales tool. I think to be more efficient and yet not pass it along or have any benefit come out of that, I think would be a disservice and probably will dissuade voters from spending more money. So those are my comments.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Rodriguez? comments? You're good? Okay. Ms. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When we discuss seismic issues in Santa Barbara, Cottage Hospital comes to mind with their tremendous effort that they had to do, mandated by the state. And I can't even imagine that the state doesn't mandate the same for public safety institutions. We demand it for public health, and every hospital in the state of California had to either retrofit or close. Or, you know, you could build on a new site, but there was no acceptance for seismic for the non-upgrade of quality for seismic. And I can't even imagine, as I said, I'll repeat it, that they wouldn't do that for public safety. We should require it for public safety. I think the people that work in that call center are the bravest people I ever saw. Because if I sat there underneath that pile of blocks, I would be worried, you know. I mean, seriously, it is a real, in the case of a disaster, it is the disaster. The disaster will be that the people that need to get to us can't do it. They won't even be able to make a call. The building is way past its prime. It's completely outdated systems. The accessibility issues have already been mentioned, but I'm going to just go ahead and take my time for the comments because I don't want to leave anything out. Our responsibility as citizens and as employers and as parents and any teachers, whatever we are, our responsibility is to anticipate the problem and provide the solution before we have a big tragedy, before we have Legionnaire's disease in that building. There was an open pipe dripping down in the locker room, and I thought, well, I wonder if the lowest guy on the totem is the guy that's got that locker, because somebody's got to stand there in that liquid and open their locker and get dressed. That is horrible. Bad conditions. I would expect it in a developing nation. I sure wouldn't expect it in Santa Barbara. I think rather than take people on tours, I certainly would photograph and document some of these conditions and make that public. I personally did drive all my children around that street at one time or another and say, that's the pokey, you better be good. Everybody understood you don't want to go there. And I would not invite people into that environment. First of all, it's unhealthy. And second of all, if there was a problem, a person tripped or, you know, got something there, which could happen, I just wouldn't expose anybody, either the public or the necessity for security, but I would show the conditions in another way. The asbestos, you know, part of the need to do this in an expeditious fashion has to do with the toxic materials that would be released if there were a disaster. If there were damage to that building, all the neighbors would be exposed to its asbestos. All the neighbors would be exposed to its lead paint, its ductwork, everything. And that's a building where some unsavory people have been. It's not like, you know, I mean, there's a lot living in that place. So I would definitely, I'm anxious to have it done. The point, one of the points I want to bring up is that design is problem solving. We do that. I'm a designer. I solve with design. I am not so much worried about HLC and, you know, any of that. Those are things that can be addressed. In terms of need, though, that must be addressed first of all. And we are very good going through our boards and commissions with courtesy reviews. The architects that are retained are very familiar. I don't feel that I'm not anxious that we will not do a good job of the police department. And Mr. Hogerman, you know, we have been in all of processes that I've observed as first on HLC and then a planning commissioner, most considerate of neighbors. Never seen consideration for neighbors like we have done. We've driven design by neighbors. We've sheltered them. We've enclosed our projects. We have tough conditions of approval that people must legally conform to. So I want to assure the neighbors that this project would be just as respectfully done as our other major projects have been done. And I think that the staff is anxious to have that be that way. Funding, you know, it is a priority. I think it's such a priority that even if De La Guerra Plaza took 2.2 mil, and maybe it took part of that 2.2 mil to move the people from the basement of the collapsible call center over to a place that was much more secure, I'll hold on De La Guerra Plaza, certainly. I'll hold on everything to get this done. To me, it's that kind of a priority. So I am looking forward to more, not less. I've toured this facility 3 times, and every time its need has grown. The place I saw this time, it wasn't because of what you would call neglect by demolition or anything like that. It's by sheer volume of people going to work, walking on worn-out floors, having to deal with public safety and a worn-out building. The building is worn out. So that's what I have to say, and I completely agree with Vice Chair Christensen. I think her comments were very cogent and appreciated. And so I say let's go forward and, like I said, anticipate the problems and seek the solution, scratch our heads on funding and reprioritize, and if we have a nickel, this is where it should be spent. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Larson. Ms. Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My comments are going to touch on cost, my tour observations, and public outreach. First on cost, as a follow-on to Commissioners Jordan and Christensen, I want to echo something and press even further, and that is that I think in this project, in the reconstruction of the police headquarters being the #1 priority as Council has identified it, it must be, if necessary, the only priority for allocation of our RDA monies through the sunsetting of the RDA, which I understand is 2015, Mr. Casey. So I'm not sure if that takes the remaining, what is it, 12, 13 million, no, 14 to 16 million dollars, and then we still have a gap. But I think that pushing the envelope and being as innovative and as exploratory as possible within the city's kind of buckets of monies, we need to do everything possible to find the 50 million within the city, because I do think when we see a continued recession into next year, and from the research I've done and in talking to investment bankers, this is the new norm. We're not going to all of a sudden turn around and have another heyday next year where I think the voters will somehow find it very palatable to tax themselves in whatever vehicle may be suggested. So I think we really need to sharpen our pencils and do everything possible to find that money within the city, or I'm afraid we're going to run up against a wall with the voters. And then, as you've said, there is no plan B currently. So where do we go from there? We will have hired professionals to begin the process, and then what? It stalls out and it sits on a shelf. I don't think that's going to be perceived well in the community also. So that's on cost. In terms of my tour observations, and this is my second tour of the police headquarters in the last 12 months, I have 5 main observations. First is the seismic structural unsoundness of the building, which just must be addressed in any and all means possible. Secondly, the layout, as you've identified, Deputy Chief Mannix, is very inefficient. And certainly for our law enforcement needs, we can't afford an inefficient building that supports inefficient operations. It has so many ramifications in terms of keeping our community safe, whether our officers can't follow up appropriately on reports, whether we have evidence that stalls out in some way that the officers can't follow up on, I think it has direct implications there. Additionally, in terms of decentralization or centralization, it's the substation model, or completely rebuilding all of our needs right at the current site. I can understand from the public's perspective and neighborhood perspective how it would be appealing to have substations, and I've lived in other cities with substations. However, from a cost efficiency and operational efficiency perspective, it's really not, I think, kind of in the best interest of the city overall. And I think when we get to public outreach, I'll fold it in there, because I think you're going to have to translate that for the public, because otherwise substations seem somewhat appealing. Additionally, I think that the building security is an issue, as some of the other commissioners have mentioned. We've just gone through securitization of the historic county courthouse, and I was involved with an organization that worked with Superior Court Judge Ochoa on that. It was sensitively done. We wish that we wouldn't have to securitize that beautiful building, but there were already incidents at that building that put our community and those in the courthouse in jeopardy. We don't have to speculate if that's going to happen at our police headquarters. We know it's a matter of time. So whether or not you open it up to tours, that's, I think for your decision making. But I think in the meantime, as we go forward with design, we have to have improved security on the entire perimeter of the property as well as your interiors, I think, to be considered. Then when it comes to public outreach, I think we need to be very smart about this. We know from a number of other experiences, Plan Santa Barbara comes to mind. On the county level, the Cold Spring Bridge suicide barrier, they weren't really charrettes, but it was very similar to Plan Santa Barbara, how in various areas of the South Coast community, in large forums, there were design and Q&A opportunities for the public to come and see what it would look like, what it would mean for them, ask questions of, in this case, county representatives, in our case, city representatives, and you, and probably also the professionals that we've hired. But I think it's critical, and perhaps Commissioner Jordan mentioned this, to translate some of the terminology that you've used that we may assume is the appropriate terminology that may resonate with us. It may not translate to pressing need to support funding to the community at large. So inefficiencies inside a building may not seem pressing, but to convert that to, or to translate it to the cost to the community in terms of consequence for optimization of police resources, some of the examples that I used just a moment ago, in terms of what happens when we're behind in issuing reports and in processing critical crime evidence and so forth. What does that mean to the community in terms of their safety? That perhaps would increase public education and maybe win the hearts and minds of the public, which I think, you have a steep climb there, but I think we can do it if it's done in a smart way. So I think with all of that, we've certainly got a lot to do, and I want to go back and just lastly, Mr. Casey, underscore what I think is a pressing need to go back to the drawing board on the financing before you take a bond or a tax measure forward, and I guess you're going to do some polling at some point. But if we don't have to do that polling, when we've already seen what happened with Measure S and other, more recent bonds, I think it would really be in our best interest if we could do that. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Schwartz. Starting with the tour. The tour, for me, revealed I think, dangerous and deplorable conditions that, when extrapolated, really put forth a worst-case scenario waiting to happen in terms of the seismicity, the building conditions, all of the various things that were outlined in the presentation this afternoon that were responded to as needs. And I heard that this is a very complex project, and if you want to make it a complex project, I guess from a technical standpoint, it is a very complex project. But don't make the public process a complex project. In this regard, less is more. I think the public is tired of being lectured about what they should think. And what really needs to take place is not just more information, but better information and focused information that people can connect to. Because the problem needs to be framed in terms of the community, even though the needs emanate from the ability of the police department to deliver the oldest services in the West. Every town in the West had a sheriff, you know, and we got a sheriff and we got a police department, and that was the first public service in the founding of the western part of this country. And I think that just shows historically that it is a significant and compelling need. And so I've got very, very strong support for this, and I really hope that in the limited amount of time you do as many things as well as you can in the right order, but don't over-engineer it. So that's about my caution about making this thing too complex. What really needs to happen in terms of framing is that it has to be communicated to people's hearts and minds and values that the status quo is not acceptable, that the community's quality of life will suffer significantly if the problem goes unsolved. If you can't make a compelling argument to that effect, the project is dead. And let's not waste the money. So the most important thing that I think you can do is not just focus on need, but connecting need to community problems. Because if the community doesn't own the problem ain't getting solved in this town. Anyway, I don't think. It's too democratic to expect otherwise. Then I think you really need to explore and factor in cost escalation over time. Because we had a discussion earlier this year about the difference between a 10-foot median on Highway 101 and a 6-foot median that would be viewed for all of 0.7 of a second or 7 seconds or whatever it was. And in the time between when that project was initially designed, it took 20 years, and the cost multiplied by factors, orders of magnitude. And I think you really have to have command of your numbers so that you can help someone explore how they're going to make up that cost difference if you have a 5-year delay. Because that 5-year delay is going to be huge in what you have to substitute or go without in order to make up that shortfall. And however you frame your ballot, however you decide to move forward, and I think Commissioner Christensen really hit the nail on the head, and she was spot on. And so I think framing is everything on this piece. And I think you need to, and because we have a robust design process, I don't want to shortchange the design process, but the difference between 10 feet and 6 feet and tens of thousands of dollars and more than that, I think we're going to get good architecture, whether we have 6 meetings of the HLC and 6 meetings of the ABR or 20 meetings of each body. And if you're in a situation where you're hearing this process to death and you're in front of HLC 10, 12 times, I think something's wrong with that picture. There's got to be leadership that if this is the most important project, that it will be well done, but you have to set deadlines and milestones and abide by those and have a contingency plan if those are not met. Otherwise, we're going to be spending millions and millions of construction dollars on process and interest and the cost of money. And I think that would be a tragedy in this case. I think you need to, in terms of the public outreach process, I think you need to understand how this project will change, or the lack of this project will change how the police services that matter to the community are affected. You almost have to use the same approach that Northern Ireland and Great Britain used in taking their peace agreement to a national vote, to frame it not as an uncertainty of what might happen, but a certainty of what might happen if you don't choose the right course. And because otherwise it's going to take a lot of time and we won't get the job done. Cottage had a deadline. They had a state-mandated deadline. And I think it looks pretty darn good as a project that was constructed under a deadline. So I wouldn't be afraid of losing something for the community by setting some hard deadlines here. And I think that, lastly, you have to appeal to your most legitimate critics in the community and address their concerns early on in terms that they can buy into and support. You have to use their language to talk to them, not our language to talk to them, because our language is filled with a bunch of letters and numbers, and it's, you know, it sometimes doesn't make sense to the average person. So with that, I think you've got some pretty good input to go forward with from the two commissions. I'd be interested to hear what you take away in terms of the most cogent perspectives you've heard today.
First off,
I really enjoy having you up here, Mr. Casey, because I only have 4 months left on the commission, and I want to give you the hardest, best questions I can.
Let me summarize 11 very well-informed comments. And no, thank you very much for all the input. I think it's very valuable and very helpful. And we used you all today almost kind of as a focus group of the community to kind of see where we are and what the reaction was. And I think you gave us some really good information and feedback. I heard community outreach is critical. Keep it simple, make the messaging strong. I heard minimize to the greatest extent possible what we, if anything, have to ask the voters for. And I think we share that concern that the economic times are not good and they're not looking great in the near term going forward. And so that means turning over every rock, and if this really is the number one priority, the council needs to think about putting every dime into this project and making it happen. I heard that from a number of people, and so I think they're going to have to think about that as they go forward in the next few months and kind of think about how to move forward. In that, I think we took good notes on everything else. I think we've got some good information. I heard keep it simple on the process and keep HLC's feet to the fire to design a good project. I agree with Commissioner Lodge. I think the community expects this to be a good civic building as well, so we can't sacrifice design, but we can be expeditious about how we do it and efficient about how we do it. And so I heard that balance as well. But a lot of very good comments. Really appreciate all your input today.
Thank you, Mr. Casey, and the leadership from the police department. You're very helpful, not just today, but on the tour. The tour was very, very compelling. And with that, I think we have completed our tasks, and we are prepared to adjourn. So, Mr. Cato?
Yes, my understanding that it was the Police and Fire Commission's intent to continue their meeting, but my understanding now is the staff says that that's not going to happen, so I recommend that both commissions adjourn.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed? We're adjourned. Thank you.